All right, let's just jump right into this explainer. Today, we're exploring a seriously fascinating theme, and that is warfare. But we aren't just talking about swords and shields clashing on a battlefield. We're actually going to trace a path starting all the way from the hidden spiritual battles happening right inside the human soul, and then we're going to expand outward to the monumental military clashes that literally shaped world history. So it's a journey from the intimately personal all the way to the massively geopolitical.
To make sense of all these incredible sources, we're following a clear micro to macro path. We'll start with Seraphim Rose's spiritual warfare, then move on to nihilism and modern revolution, look at the foundations of Orthodox faith, touch on early apologetics and Gnosticism, and finally wrap up with historical conflicts and the Crusades.
Starting off with Section 1, Seraphim Rose's spiritual warfare. We have to begin at the most personal level possible, the internal struggle of the individual. And this micro-level battlefield is chronicled extensively by the influential 20th century Orthodox monk, Father Seraphim Rose. From a remote cabin in Northern California, he produced an incredibly prolific body of writings that had a profound worldwide impact. One of his most wildly popular books is called The Soul After Death. It's a really captivating read because Rose outlines the soul's journey after passing, framing our everyday reality as a constant defense against what he calls aerial powers and unseen demons. Drawing on 2,000-year-old Orthodox teachings, he argues that the spiritual realm isn't just some peaceful waiting room, It's a space of active trial. But we don't just see this in his published books. We see this concept translated into practical advice across his hundreds of deeply pastoral personal letters. Writing to his spiritual children, like a woman named Nina, Rose advises that maintaining faith requires daily, disciplined effort. He actually tells her to read the Gospels daily and points her specifically toward another book titled Unseen Warfare. For Rose, prayer and faith are absolutely not passive states. They are a literal daily combat against despair and spiritual death. Moving right along to Section 2. Nihilism and modern revolution. Let's zoom out a bit from the individual soul to society at large. How does this unseen warfare manifest in our culture? Well, in another major piece of his writing, his book titled Nihilism, the Root of the Revolution of the Modern Age, Rose argues that society's rejection of God doesn't just happen overnight. It progresses through 4 distinct stages of what he calls a nihilistic dialectic. It starts with liberalism, moves to realism, then shifts to vitalism, and ultimately culminates in the nihilism of destruction. And he sees this final stage perfectly illustrated in movements like the Bolshevik Revolution or Hitler's regime. So the crucial takeaway from Rose's writing here is that he doesn't just see nihilism as passive doubt or mere atheism. No, he defines it as an active, destructive war against divine truth. It's a rebellion where humanity attempts to build a world revolving around absolute nothingness. The internal spiritual battle of the individual has basically become a structural war waged by modern society. Which brings us to Section 3, Foundations of Orthodox Faith. To really understand what Seraphim Rose was fighting so hard to protect with all his books and letters, we have to look at the ancient foundations of the Orthodox Christian worldview. According to the Orthodox Study Bible, the Church has essentially been in a continuous defensive posture since its inception. The mission has been to preserve true Christian faith and worship since the time of Christ. And that act of preservation is, in itself, a form of protracted warfare against changing worldly philosophies. Let's look at how that played out in Section 4, Early Apologetics and Gnosticism. Those early centuries were fraught with intense ideological and physical battles against competing sects. The unseen warfare was very much seen in the early days of the Church. We see deep ideological schisms in texts like the Nag Hammadi library. Gnostics believed the material world was an inherently hostile place. In the Marzanis text, they literally divided humanity into mortal non-believers bound to the material world and immortal Gnostics who possessed a divine spark. This battle over the nature of the soul was a fight for the very definition of Christianity. But this warfare got very real very fast. It wasn't just theological. As the early apologist Justin Martyr documented, the Roman state was actively hunting believers. Under the Roman prefect Urbicus, Christians were being condemned to death simply for admitting their faith. This pushes the conflict entirely out of the realm of philosophy and directly into state-sanctioned executions. The battle for the soul was now costing actual lives. And finally, Section 5, Historical Conflicts and Crusades. Now, we reach our macro-level scale. We've gone from the individual soul to societal philosophy to early state persecution. Now let's look at the massive geographical and military clashes of the Middle Ages. Rodney Stark wrote a book called God's Battalions, and he makes a highly debated and controversial case regarding the Crusades. Contrary to the modern narrative that the Crusades were unprovoked European colonialism, Stark argues that they were actually a delayed defensive reaction to centuries of Islamic expansion. Stark highlights a rapid timeline of conquests. Starting in the 7th century, Islamic armies systematically conquered massive Christian territories. We're talking Syria in 633, Jerusalem in 638, Egypt in 640, and all the way to Spain by 711. Stark details how these relatively small, highly mobile Arab armies, using camels to totally outflank the static, lumbering Byzantine and Persian defenses, captured the majority of the Christian world in just a few decades. It's a staggering historical shift. So Stark argues that it was in direct response to centuries of these incursions, the loss of these historic lands, and the reported persecution of pilgrims that Pope Urban II finally calls for the First Crusade at the Council of Clermont in 1095. In Stark's telling, Urban's plea wasn't framed as an unprovoked land grab, but as a desperate rescue mission to protect Eastern Christians and secure holy sites. Now, this data from Stark's research is absolutely wild. It reveals that while the military conquests were incredibly fast, the spiritual conversion of these newly occupied populations took centuries. I mean, look at this. It took 252 years for just half of Syria to convert. This shows that the religious shift wasn't an instant wave. It was the result of slow, grinding social pressure and heavy taxation on non-believers, what the sources call dimitude. It was quite literally a centuries-long battle of endurance for the local populations. As we wrap up this explainer, we have to ask ourselves a profound question. How do the internal struggles of the soul mirror the external conflicts of empires? We've looked at Father Seraphim Rose's books advising spiritual children to fight daily against despair. And we've looked at massive armies clashing over the borders of empires. Whether it's fighting aerial demons in daily prayer, resisting the philosophical creep of modern nihilism, or armored knights marching across the sands of the Middle East, we see a recurring theme here. The battlefield constantly changes its shape and scale, but the warfare, well, it never seems to end. Perhaps this fundamental instinct, the drive to fight for and defend what we hold sacred, whether inside our own minds or out in the world, is exactly what makes us human. So what do you think your unseen warfare looks like today?